unload about what you thought about the test. So tell me what you thought. Go ahead, speak. Literally, nobody wants to talk? Oh, come on. So I haven't really started reading them yet, and I promise you won't influence my grading by whatever you say. I wasn't necessarily looking for you to tell me it was a horrible, difficult test, because I already knew that. But I thought that perhaps there were issues about the test that you wanted to talk about in terms of, you know, what conclusions you drew about it. Anybody have any issues?
Can they hear you?
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
I can.
Okay.
We're thinking of good answers.
So you must have some feelings about it. I mean, you know, certainly it raises a lot of controversial issues, right? Basically, it raises everything that we talk about in the course in one way or another. How to balance, you know, the rights of individuals as against the rights of a group or even the majority is certainly a big question raised by this. RX, you brought that up in your test. I did briefly sort of, you know, scan these things. I haven't read them closely yet, but RX was of the opinion that Angela should be permitted to go free only if she agreed that she had to stop the asteroid from hitting Earth, because she has a responsibility. She has duties, as well as rights. And so I thought that would be an interesting question to ask you guys about. Does she? I mean, the point is they've held this woman captive for 40 years, and now suddenly, you know, for instrumental reasons, i.e., that they don't have the technology to stop the asteroid from hitting the Earth, and she's the only one who could plausibly do it. And now they're prepared to consider letting her go, but only because they believe that she has the capacity to do this. So the question is if she is the one who has exclusively the capacity to do this. Well, first issue is, you know, kind of bad to torture the person that you feel that you are now relying upon for your very lives. But the other thing is that how RX did you what leverage did you think that you could use against her in order to force her to agree to do this thing?
I'm sorry. Could you repeat that question?
What leverage did you think that you had to force her to do this thing, to assume this responsibility?
So if she does not agree to do this, she will be like a normal prisoner being incarcerated in a normal way, like a normal prisoner.
Ah, I see. Okay. And that's leverage how?
Yeah.
How is that leverage, RX? What bargaining power do you have? If she's been tortured her entire life, if her life has been abysmal because of repeated assaults and everything that was described in the test, and you now are going to jail her, and you're going to continue to brutalize her, and that provides you with what kind of leverage? Because at this point, this woman probably wouldn't care if all of humanity died in light of what they've done to her. So if she dies as well, that would probably be fine with her, don't you think? So what's your leverage?
I don't think that's a really real leverage to impress her, but that's just how we deal with this stuff with a normal person. So if a normal person just have this obligation, but failed to do so.
But where does the obligation come from? Why does she have an obligation?
Because our Earth is in danger, and she has the capacity to save the community. And
where's her obligation? The very community that brutally tortured her. Where's her obligation? What does she owe that community that has brutally tortured her?
Because she is a human being, and
well, so you're going to grant she's a human being, but you also suggested that if she was found to be a psychopath, you know, a person who's been innocent her entire life and brutally tortured, but she's a psychopath. How is that?
If she is a psychopath, then
how is she a psychopath? RX, where's the evidence that she's a psychopath? She's been tortured since her infancy. Where's the evidence that she's a psychopath?
What I meant was that we are not sure whether she is a psychopath. We have to only first release her, and then we will know whether she is a psychopath or not. So
okay, so why would you even make that assumption about somebody? Where's that assumption coming from? Because the reality is she's been tortured, so wouldn't it be more reasonable to argue that the people who are torturing her suffer from an absence of conscience, i.e. psychopathy? Who is the psychopath in this picture? Her? She's been tortured since infancy.
I did not mean that she is a psychopath. I think that the government should first release her, and then when she has her own conscience and will, and see whether she is a normal person or she have this tendency of...
so if she refuses, your argument is if she refuses to help the people who tortured her, that makes her a psychopath. Is that how it goes?
I think the people who has... It's not like the whole community of the human beings all tortured her. So just a part of human being tortured her, and some human beings don't even know her existence.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think maybe we can put some punishment on the people who has tortured her, but I think that is unreasonable because we cannot create retroactive law. So,
but this is not retroactive law. Rape is prohibited by the law. That's not retroactive. There's no retroactivity here. Where's the retroactivity?
Because I think the status of Angela is not determined before the government or the...
So you're actually suggesting that people who intentionally assaulted her genitalia did not know they were doing it and did not know what the implications of that were. Is that really your argument?
I think the people doing it may not think that she is a human being.
Okay, but you know that we call that discrimination, and it's prohibited by the laws of most states. So it's okay then if they just didn't think she was a human being. Her brutal abuse was okay. Is that it? Because you know the ignorance of the law and mistaken fact do not protect you in criminal law, at least not in common law, and I doubt it does in civil law either.
I guess what I thought was just like the emergence of Angela is a totally new thing, and
but she's been around for 40 years, and people have been abusing her for 40 years, so this is not new. This was just something that has been covered up, and obviously people have agreed to lie about it in order to cover it up, and other people, of course, have been tortured if they sought out information about it openly. So, you know, Amelie, you there?
Yeah.
Amelie, are you there?
She just said she's in the library.
Oh, okay. Because Amelie's argument was, look, you know, she's been enslaved for 40 years. And she, this was actually an answer to the question, can she, you know, be expected to start healing everybody? And Amelie, at least in that case, said, well, we have no right to impose that obligation on her. Even if she can do it, she's not under an obligation to do it, because that would just be another form of slavery. So why can we impose the obligation on her to stop the asteroid? Anybody? Saving one life at a time, or saving the life of the entire planet? I mean, either way, we're compelling her to do something. Is that okay? Oh, I think you guys want to say yes, but you need to make an argument for why it's okay. That's persuasive. Andrew. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Sorry, I had to turn on my microphone.
So answer. Oh Lord, you have that horrible feedback thing going on again.
Yours, whose microphone is on?
You have to turn your microphone off.
No, it's not. So can you repeat the question again? We're having some technical difficulties.
I get that. So the question is, what is the distinction? Amelie said we shouldn't have the right to, compel her to, I know she's there because I just found, we can only respond through typing. So we have a bunch of people here who are responding through typing who are in the library. Okay,
Right.
so anyway, Amelie said, and I'm sorry, I know I'm mispronouncing your name, so forgive me. In connection with her healing powers, presuming that it's proven finally that she really possesses them, that we don't have the right to compel her suddenly to become a healer, that would just constitute another form of slavery. So if she chose to, if she wanted to, despite all that has happened to her, help other people, then that would be her choice, but we could not compel her. So what is the distinction between saving people's lives one at a time and saving the entire species? Because if this asteroid strikes, it's an extinction level event.
The distinction would be that I think it's largely a matter of time, because if we have an imminent threat to the survival of the species, then any subsequent attempt to save lives one step at a time would be rendered useless, because if the entire species
Yeah, but
goes...
it's still a decade away or so, if I recall the facts that I wrote correctly. It's not imminent.
Right. Okay, so in that point, especially since the hypothetical you posed said that there may be additional technological means in place to prevent this asteroid from striking us, perhaps we can take some time to try to free her from her state, and then through legal rehabilitative means try to convince her that to overlook the trauma she inflicted to help people out. That's sort of what I thought.
Andrew, first I have to know, the hypothetical doesn't say that there are means. The hypothetical says
there might be.
There could be.
Yeah.
Whereas, there seems to be some argument to be made that if she chose to do it, there would be some certainty that she could.
Right.
Now, the question is, and I didn't actually include this in the hypothetical, but, it must surely have occurred to you. She's been compared to a quantum computer, right?
Correct.
And the reality is that when human beings take her over, they do not possess that ability. They are not quantum computers, right?
Right.
So
if I'm correct in understanding it, it seems like they are able to feel and sense the things that she feels, but they can't
utilize her mind. They cannot utilize her mind.
What she can, because they have a different level of intelligence that she does.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So the reality is that if they were able, the only way they could certainly figure out how, by a computer, how to guide the asteroid, but the problem is that the person who takes her head over wouldn't have the ability to implement it. Doesn't that seem probable?
Seems very probable.
Right.
So then it would have then given that the most safe and reasonable solution would be like, we have to find some way for her, through her own agency, to use her powers to augment the technology, because she's the only one who could properly and fully manage this incredible intelligence.
So, Amelie, back to you. I briefly have an idea. Oh, shoot, I was going to ask you. Oh, I remember in class you said something about she needs to be, she is surely going to be suffering from something akin to post-traumatic stress disorder following all of this. So how would you address what has happened to her? You got a decade now. You've let her go in anticipation of this asteroid striking. What would you do for her? She's typing. You guys, you probably have her message there, as a message board as well, right? She's still typing. Okay, she says, well, there's an argument to be made that her right to health also includes protection and expectation to mental health. More typing. And the World Health Organization is promoting mental well-being and health for women and children. So if you do release her, which obviously you should, there has to be some kind of mental health protection in place because that would be in line with her rights. Okay. But as to what specifically the medical details of that would be, I'm not 100% sure of what would be feasible. Okay, fair enough. More coming. Trauma treatment, perhaps. Okay, so are we sort of like out of our depth here? Because we're talking about somebody who, mentally, if physically in appearance is like us, mentally she's kind of far removed from us. So how do we fix it? What do we do? Is there any way to fix what we've done to her? Laura, I'm volunteering you.
Well, I think it's like you said, trying to figure out if there's any way to respond to her mental health is difficult, knowing that her whole mental system is different from ours, in that she's like a quantum computer. So I think in my midterm, in one of my recommendations, I said she should have some kind of rehabilitative therapy when she's released and be briefed on the incoming asteroid and everything and given the choice to respond. But
so you would make it a choice, Laura?
I'm sorry?
You would make it a choice?
I would make it a choice, yes, because I think that forcing her to do anything isn't changing her situation. It's just enslaving her for a different purpose.
So you agree with Amelie on that part?
Yes.
Okay.
But as far as her mental health and well-being, I think she does have that right, and I think that going on what we know about human mental health, that's what the people would have to go on and what they would have to enforce. But of course, it's an unprecedented situation, so they would have to respond accordingly.
Would you, in addition to that, Laura, I think that RX mentioned maybe, action should be taken against the people who have harmed her. Would you agree with that? Would that help the situation any?
I think that it's difficult to prosecute against people who have taken harm against her because the nature of her attacks have been telekinetic, so it's hard to pinpoint or have evidence on
She's a witness.
who did.
She's-
Okay, but
I mean,
it's
once
literally
she's
a lot
released,
of the population of
right?
the
But
world.
once she's released, she will know, and she will be able to say who did what to her. So, and certainly, if in a criminal prosecution, you only need one witness, and that is, provided the person is alive, and that would be the complainant, that is the victim of the crime. So, she knows with certainty who did what to her. So, should she be permitted to proceed through the courts and should the people, that is to say the prosecutor in the jurisdiction in which she resides, be under an obligation to do something? I mean, here we're talking about presumably the prosecutor, that the district attorney's office was fully aware of what was going on, and certainly if they weren't before, they are now. And they certainly, if a crime occurs in front of them, while there is prosecutorial discretion, they're certainly under some kind of obligation, aren't they, to do something about what's been done to her? Or
Well,
no?
certainly if she raises a criminal case, then it has to be pursued because crime has been committed against her. All I'm saying is that pinpointing every single person who has traumatized her in the past 40 years will be statistically impossible. But making
So
an
do we
example
do-
of certain people would definitely be an outcome that could be possible.
So you think that we should do something along the lines of the ICC and address those people who are the most
Yes.
responsible?
I would say that, yes.
Grant, what do you think?
I would agree with Laura that you just make an example out of some high-profile people.
Does that...
Because there's no way to track down everyone. So
Okay.
you gotta just use a couple people to make an example as like a deterrent of some kind.
Doesn't that seem somehow unjust, though?
Well, when a genocide takes place and it's a whole group of people trying to kill a whole another group of people, after the genocide is done, the entire group of people does not get prosecuted against usually, right? There's transitional justice and certain leaders or organizers or facilitators of the genocide are punished. And I would say, like in the Nuremberg trials.
So do you think there
I-
should at least be some form of reparations?
Yes, reparation, yes, but I think it's illogical to say that every single person who has committed a crime against Angela can be punished, especially when it's become a naturalized and systematic crime.
Isn't there also an
Andrew, were you speaking?
Yes. Yes. I was going to say, like,
Did we lose you? Are you still
Yeah, sorry, accidentally for a second. I know we also talked in class last week how we can look at this whole situation as sort of an ongoing crime against humanity too, since people were also involuntarily harmed because of Angela's telekinesis. So I'm not quite sure what the implications of that all are, but I think that's something we have to take into consideration when we analyze how reparations could go, because there was a degree of harm perpetrated on so many other people as well.
Well, certainly people who were, incarcerated in so-called mental health facilities, and given drugs to compel them to agree she doesn't exist, certainly they deserve some kind of reparations as well, right?
Well, and from the part, I think it was question 2 in the hypothetical, I sort of noted in my answer that it seems like some of the people, some of the voices that were heard seemed to be intentionally hurting Angela, and then there seemed to be other people who were just sort of in range and were getting involuntarily harmed or experiencing things that they didn't necessarily want to. So.
Okay, and I'm sorry, I'm not certain. Were the people who were being harmed, were those people hurting Angela in reaction to that, or were those people just innocent victims entirely?
I think it was actually a little unclear, because if I remember correctly, question 2 was, part of the question was asking you to identify ways that the intern's observations could be improved, and that's one thing that I listed. I was like, need to pay more attention to the environmental factors so that we can better determine intent, like who specifically was doing the harm and who was being harmed via this. But I think my general point was like, there's two things going on. There are people who seem to be harming her and people who are being accidentally harmed.
As a product of that.
As a product of that.
Okay. Well, we could go on with this for hours because plainly this is infinitely complicated. But I do think it is interesting, you know, that I mean, we could have just with this midterm, we could have addressed pretty much everything else that comes up in the midterm hypothetical. But we'll go back to it, obviously, during the final. I mean, for instance, children's rights were obviously also raised because, as we know, they were attacking her from the time she was a child. And I think it is interesting, going back to children's rights. Obviously, we talked about it a little bit in connection with women's rights, but now we're talking about it in connection with children's rights. Do they have any? Are they mere property? And the answer to that, RX, I may have disagreed with what you had to say, but I do believe that most of the world agrees with you that children are effectively property. And so the reality is that while I described women's rights as being a stepchild to human rights, children's rights are really truly at the very bottom of the hierarchy of human rights. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but it has been observed, at least in the US, that there tends to be a cycle of rights. First, Americans become concerned with the humane treatment of animals, which seems to serve as some kind of reawakening after sort of a dormant period where there's no sort of movement on human rights at all. Then we move on to focus to racial discrimination, which we certainly seem to be in the middle of now. Black Lives Matter. Then there tends to come around feminism. Actually, the periods between these things seem to be sort of shorter than they have been in the past, because certainly the Me Too movement would seem to be, around feminist response to what's going on. But last of all, and this is really extraordinary when you think of it, but last of all, we get to the humane treatment of children. So what is, and I suppose this raises some of the same questions that are raised by persons suffering from developmental disabilities. And that is the people, and it shows you that malignant really human society is, that those people who are in the weakest position, those people who can most easily be harmed, are also the last people whose human rights we tend to address. And of course, therefore, children's rights are at the very bottom of the pile. So what do you think that is about? Wouldn't you think that we would step forward and the first people's rights we would be concerned with are those who are most vulnerable? And yet always it seems to be quite the opposite is true. Anyone? Tatiana, we haven't heard from you. What do you have to say about that? You there, Tatiana? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, then, Andrew, you're here still. You speak. What do you think? Why would the most vulnerable people in our society be the last ones to receive the protection of human rights?
As terrible as this sounds, it's probably because they're the ones that are least likely to be able financially and intelligently to mount a case against the crimes that have been committed against them. We sort of talked about this earlier in the course, like there's this theme about how, legal protections are somewhat middle class or like upper because they're the ones that have the resources to access the law.
Right.
So, law inevitably most reflects those concerns, the concerns of that group of people.
Right. Amelie says because they're vulnerable, they don't have the visibility or the political muscle. Danielle says there's no visibility for marginalized people, which would make sense for their rights to be on the back burner. Linda Dos Santos says individuals that tend to be the most vulnerable, they typically remain marginalized without opportunity to intervene. Still typing. But yeah, I think that's exactly the point. I mean, you know, years ago, I was working on a volunteer basis, with a group up in Boston that addressed civil rights. And, you know, I thought it was interesting because I was talking to an old civil rights guy, you know, I'm trying to place in time when this would have been. I would have been in my 30s, so this would have been almost 30 years ago already. Isn't that horrible? I'm almost 60. Oh my God, shoot me. Anyway, so almost 30 years ago, I'm talking to this old civil rights lawyer, not lawyer, but warrior. I don't know that he actually was a lawyer. I only chatted with him briefly on a single day. But what he told me is that women were selfish because they demanded rights. Is that extraordinary to anybody here? So we know then that women who did not have resources at their disposal, who did not who obviously suffered all of the abuse that other African Americans, specifically male African Americans, suffered, except for in addition to that, you know, they were basically being abused by their own, who said, you know, you're not entitled to rights. Then the very fact that you have demanded them is selfish on your part. Is that extraordinary or not? Matt, what do you think?
In regards to your question on whether or not certain groups feel entitled to, or rather feel like they must exclude each other.
Well, effectively, I guess that's what I'm really saying, right? That black men didn't think that black women should be able to demand rights because that was selfish of them to do. That was his words, I swear to you. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think it's inherently unjust, right, to prevent other people from demanding the rights that they're entitled to. So I think that's a fundamentally deleterious argument to make, that just because one's own rights are being violated doesn't mean that other people, even like within your own community, can seek to advance their own rights.
So why do you think, I mean, I guess we're really talking about a patriarchal argument, right? I mean, why would he even make such an argument? Again, I remind you, this was 30 years ago and things have changed, but where was that coming from even?
I think it comes from a place of animosity and a place of just sort of not willing to interrogate existing power structures because it is already convenient. I think any sort of advancement in society, sort of legal or otherwise, like demands an uncomfortable sort of re-examining of the state of society as it is, and with that acknowledging what are the shortcomings, why are those systems in place, and how do we address them. And some people, for example, if one perceives that the subjugation of others is directly beneficial to their own well-being, I highly doubt that they would ever frame it in that way, but there may be some sort of like subconscious acknowledgement of that I think any sort of mission to sort of bring people out of this subjugation would be treated with hostility by people in the, quote, like elite group, as it were.
So at least among African Americans, the elite group would be men, right?
In this case, yes.
Okay. And in fact, I think we talked about this a little bit last week. The reality was that, you know, when in a recent civil rights documentary, the argument was made, you know, the question was asked, well, how come women weren't, you know, taken seriously, why weren't they involved in the leadership of the movement? And the answer was, well, it was largely, a religious leadership, so women were not even considered to be part of that. So, I guess I find it shocking that one would think that if we see people who are suffering and we ourselves are also suffering, that the response would be, some kind of empathy for their suffering because we share something in kind. But the reality is not necessarily that, right? The reality is, me first, which is natural enough. We're going to focus on our own self-interest, but amazingly and often to the exclusion of the self-interest of other people who are suffering in similar fashion. Anyway, so, and of course, in this case, most appallingly, we're talking about children who are suffering in similar fashion. And I think what's interesting here is you will note, when looking at our articles, that they are all written by women, all by itself a clear indication of how lowly children's rights really are deemed to be, because men, generally speaking, and this has historically been true again in our patriarchal society, care and concern for children is a woman's job, beneath the dignity of men. So if you see, even now, that women are overrepresented in a particular profession, it is a fact that means that particular profession is not deemed to be particularly elite. So women attorneys are dominant in family law and on the family court bench, at least in America. Women are also dominant in developmental psychology, K through 12 education, etc., etc., etc. How many of you guys in grade school happen to have a male teacher? Anybody? I had one. Exactly one. He was a science teacher. Anybody have any male teachers while they were in grade school?
I had several.
You did?
Yes.
Linda DeSantis is, and Francesca both say I did.
I did. I had one.
You had exactly one?
Yes. Great teacher.
Amelie says she had nothing but male teachers from 3rd through 7th grade. That's astonishing because in America that's just not so. I mean, to the degree that male teachers in America become, involved, it usually tends to be in high school because, again, teaching older kids is deemed to be somehow more prestigious than teaching younger kids, right? So anyway, I'm really amazed, Amelie, and when we meet next, you're going to have to explain to me how that's even possible, because that is so not true here in the United States. I should note, my uncle was a grade school teacher. He taught primary grades, I think it was like 1st through 3rd. And, that was really extraordinary because it was, at least in my experience, so uncommon. Anyway, what I think is interesting also is that Donnelly not only failed to include a chapter on women's rights, he also wrote nothing about children's rights. And as to women's rights and more broadly group rights, he actually opposed addressing things in that manner. Now, everybody maintains that they care about children naturally, of course. Few people actually want to teach them or defend them because there's no prestige in it. As I said, my mom was a high school teacher for years. She started out in elementary school, but the bulk of her career was teaching special ed in the high school. And one of the things she brought to my attention, and one of the reasons why she finally just left and she'd had enough, she had not yet hit mandatory retirement age, but she left anyway. And that was because she had students, stand up in class and look her square in the face and say, if you were so smart, you wouldn't be here, you would be earning money. So there really is no prestige in teaching in public schools, and that is not merely something that, broadly in society we understand, but specifically kids see it that way as well, which is just wrong. Obviously, once upon a time, teachers were indeed regarded as being people, with a substantial body of knowledge, and were treated with respect. But that time has obviously long passed. I mean, when I was a child, during the 60s, the whole notion of downgrading prestige was it sort of implicit in everything, so that, you know, lawyers, clergy, the three traditional professions, lawyers, clergy, and doctors, especially the lawyers and clergy, were attacked as being presumptuous, thinking that there was something special about them. Doctors, I suppose, were perhaps more insulated from this than lawyers and clergy. But also, it became, you know, acceptable as well to downgrade the prestige of people working in the education of children K through 12. Anyway, so, and then what happened as a product of feminism is that to the K through 12 system, at least at the public schools, was that women didn't have to seek teaching as a profession. My mother was sufficiently old that she had very few choices. She could be a teacher, she could be a nurse, she could be a secretary. That was pretty much it for her. So she was still in there, you know, doing her job, and you know, I think it was fair to say that she was, in her time, elite. She had, you know, she had a undergraduate degree. She had the equivalent of 3 master's degrees. And you know, she was doing a job that for her generation would have been deemed to be give her some kind of elite status. But now, if you had that kind of background, why teach? You can go off and actually make money. And of course, that was what these kids were saying to her at the time. Anyway, as we've discussed before, elite Western women have always been heavily involved in, or perhaps we haven't, but it is nonetheless true that elite Western women have always been heavily involved in each stage of the human rights cycle. They have always been permitted to participate in charitable work, which has effectively become largely a women's domain in the West. Charitable work, as we discussed, I do know we discussed this last week, requires the same kind or degree of business prowess required in any other job, at least in the private sector. But elite women have historically not been permitted to dirty their hands in profit-making enterprises. After they finally defend their own rights, towards the end of the human rights cycle to which I previously referred, then they are in a position finally to defend their children's rights as well. So women were absolutely active. If we look back to the 60s, they've always been active in the humane treatment of animals. They've always been active in civil rights, including, of course, that period when we were more concerned with abolition. They have always been active, obviously, in women's rights, since that would be their own body of rights. And finally, they have been the most active and perhaps the only really relevant actors in protecting the rights of children. After they then, as I said, finally defend their own human rights, then finally children's rights come up. And one can observe the same phenomenon at the international level. CEDAW was adopted in 1971 by the UN General Assembly and came into force in 1981. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, or the CRC, was not adopted until 1989, and it came into force in 1990. There are only 2 states, I should look this up, forgive me, I didn't think to do this, but at the time I originally wrote these notes, which would have been 2 years ago, only Somalia and South Sudan were not party, and I seem to recall that both of those states are now party, but I also think that it continues to be true that the United States has declined to ratify the CRC because, of course, it supposes that its own laws are better. And as we well know, the United States has had this attitude about human rights, all human rights conventions pretty much, and it's regrettable, of course, where the US is a world leader and should therefore provide an example to other states. Okay, so we're at the 125 mark. Why don't we take a brief break and then we'll go ahead and we'll finish up these notes, okay? So I'm going to be gone for 5 minutes. Don't turn off your phones or your computers, but, you know, take care of whatever you need to do. See you in a few. Okay, you guys all here? So let's move on. The CRC represented a new theory of children's rights. And of course, the key point here is that children were no longer conceived of as the property of their parents, and therefore, bless you, and therefore the mere object of their rights. Excuse me, rather, it conceives of children as the subject of their own rights. And this is a critical shift in perspective, but one that comes fraught with its own problems. In any event, we'll explore those in a few minutes. One of the innovative features of the convention is its emphasis on a child's right to participate, to be heard, and to have his or her views considered. This is discussed at length in your article about multicultural citizenship. When I was a child, it was still commonly said that a child should be seen, not heard. So this constitutes a dramatic change in attitude. Notably, it is not the last word on children's rights. The OAU adopted the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child as well in 1990, and it is viewed by many to be even more progressive as it adds to the CRC and indeed offers a higher level of protection. In particular, it gives emphasis to the preservation of African cultures. I'm primarily focusing on the CRC here because, ironically, it is the most broadly ratified and under-enforced human rights treaty in the world today. The CRC covers the entire spectrum of rights, including civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. So there was a merging of the two covenants, the rights that they protected in the CRC. But also, if you looked at the CRC, you will note, in addition thereto, they merged into the CRC the protections of humanitarian law as well. There are 3 protocols to the CRC. One concerns child trafficking, another concerns child soldiers, hence humanitarian law. In 2014, there was a 3rd optional protocol allowing children to bring complaints directly to the Committee on the Rights of the Child. The committee was then to investigate the claims and direct governments, and could, as a product of their investigation, direct governments to take action. Now, one of the most interesting aspects of the story of the CRC is its implementation. It has many of the aspects of any human rights convention. First, it has a committee that is in charge of its oversight. And as I've already said, that's the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And it is exactly the same kind of committee as the Human Rights Committee, which oversees the Civil and Political Covenant. I note this because it is useful to compare the differences between the two committees and how they carry out their mandate under their respective conventions. Both committees receive periodic reports from states parties. The state reporting is under an obligation to inform the committee of what it has done to comply with the provisions of the Human Rights Convention. There is a kind of hearing where the representative of the state party appears before the relevant committee, and there is an exchange between members of the committee and the representative. The committee then issues comments on the state's party's report. In addition, my turn to cough. In addition, every committee created by a Human Rights Convention for purposes of implementation issues general comments on each of the articles of the convention. And the purpose of those general comments is to provide guidance as to the import of each provision so that the state party can better conform its domestic legislation and other official conduct to their obligations under the Human Rights Convention. Lastly, the committees of each major convention can now receive communications from individuals which inform the committee that a state party has violated his or her rights under that convention. Now, while some conventions incorporate provisions regarding human rights communications directly into the convention, others proceed by optional protocol that states parties may independently accede to if they so desire. Both the Civil and Political Covenant and the CRC have such a protocol. This means that a state can be party to either of these conventions without automatically submitting to the communications procedure, which of course is a quasi-judicial procedure. It is not a full-fledged adjudicatory procedure. It makes recommendations but of course it has no ability to enforce. So on its face, it appears that the implementation procedures of the conventions are absolutely identical, but in point of fact, the two committees operate quite differently. And here we're making a comparison between the Human Rights Committee under the Civil and Political Covenant and the Committee of the Rights of the Child. The Human Rights Committee and the Children's Rights Committee approaches to general comments are quite different to begin with. The Human Rights Committee only references other human rights conventions when it determines whether a given provision represents a non-derogable right, that is jus cogens, or when it is fleshing out the protections of the Civil and Political Covenant. By contrast, the Children's Rights Committee uses other human rights instruments as guidelines to assist states in carrying out their obligations under the convention, on the theory that all human rights are interdependent and indivisible. So this concept of interdependency and indivisibility had already sort of taken over in the Human Rights Committee by the time that this convention became binding. It also uses other human rights interpretive tools. In doing so, it uses the general comments of other treaty bodies. Its purpose is to ensure that its own comments are complementary, spelled that with an E, as in rounding things out, completing things, to the relevant treaty bodies, especially when those treaty bodies are responsible for the oversight of the core international human rights instruments like the Civil and Political Covenant. It also explicitly addresses, as I've already said, international humanitarian law, which is not, as we've discussed on more than one occasion. No problem, Tatiana. I just saw your message. I'm sorry, lost my place here. Which I previously said is not the same as human rights. One addresses the law of war, and the other one is binding during times of peace, although increasingly the position has been taken that where there are lacuna, that is to say, sort of holes in the coverage of humanitarian law, then human rights sort of fills those holes for purposes of interpretation. So in sum then, the Children's Rights Committee has a thematic approach to general comments in contrast with the article-specific approach of the Human Rights Committee. As to periodic reports, they are deemed to be the primary means of implementing both of these conventions. As with general comments, the Children's Rights Committee takes the position that an interconnected web of different human rights and humanitarian law standards protects children's rights and hence draws on a wide variety of international instruments in its concluding observations, which are issued at the conclusion of the periodic reporting process. Again, the Human Rights Committee, in contrast, rarely goes beyond the four corners of the instrument that it is called upon to interpret and apply. That is to say, it does not look beyond the convention that created the Human Rights Committee. The Children's Rights Committee calls upon states to accede to all core human rights instruments and explicitly incorporates other instruments into its analysis of a state's party's progress in implementing the CRC. Did you guys read the other articles that were assigned to you? I was going to start with Heather Montgomery. Anybody read that? You still there? Okay, so this article seems to send a mixed message. I know that she wishes child prostitution to be viewed in context. She argues that children in Thailand voluntarily engage in prostitution as a means to support their families and that it is often preferable to other forms of labor available to children. In her view, Westerners have often judged violations of human rights norms from a racist perspective. She maintains that that observation is particularly applicable when addressing child sex trafficking. I understand her concern in this regard, and I have already expressed my own dis-ease with our cultural imperialism. On the other hand, she insists that she does not wish to support child prostitution. And I was left unclear just as to what it was that she was trying to achieve. So did anybody read the article, and would you have anything to add? Sure, RX. Did you read the article?
Oh, I didn't read it. I didn't hear you calling me. Sorry.
Oh, I didn't call you. Matt? Grant?
Oh,
Anyone read this article? I guess you guys are recovering from the exam. So basically, what she was trying to do, supposedly, was show that children engaged in the prostitution industry, that they nonetheless retain their independence and dignity. Do you find that probable? Do you think that children literally become child prostitutes as a product of their own choices?
I mean, I don't think anyone, if given the option to pursue like more lucrative ventures, would ever just voluntarily become a sex worker by their own volition. I think, especially in the case of children, it's almost always coerced.
Okay.
I don't really buy the argument that it's ever a sort of choice on their part.
Okay, so some guy comes to your village and he offers you all kinds of goodies, toys, clothes, food, whatever he comes to your village with, and and is prepared to trade those things, perhaps help your family out as well. And all he asks of you is to provide him with sexual services. If you're a child, does that seem like that's a bad trade? You're starving.
I don't think a child has the ability to consent to sex in any capacity.
Okay. All right. So where do you make the cutoff line for that?
I would say like the age of consent, it would be the cutoff date there. Now, like trading material goods for sexual favors is by definition illegal, correct? So I can't condone that in any capacity.
Okay, but remember, we're talking about children and their families who are literally starving. They're going to die.
Correct.
Does that alter your analysis in any way? What?
I think it's just inherently exploitative to demand sexual favors in order for help.
Okay. And it's probably as old as a practice as there is, right? The demand for sexual favors in trade for other things. So, and certainly that would be true for women who have been who have gone into prostitution, whether by force or some people claim it's entirely voluntary. But is desperation voluntary?
I don't think desperation is.
Okay. All right. So, do you think then it is wrong-headed to try to sort of paint this picture as these children are acting of their own volition and that they retain their dignity? Or is that sort of like just an oddly mixed message?
Well, I think it's wrong-headed in its entirety, because I think it obfuscates the problem.
Okay, meaning?
Meaning that it's saying that somehow these children are to blame for their own situation, and that when presented with a sort of incentive to, or rather be placed in a situation where they cannot say no. And I think that's like saying that they're somehow acting by their own free will kind of does away with all of that, and you can't really have that conversation just by saying, oh, well, they're intentionally doing this.
Okay, so like I'm playing the devil's advocate here, but they agreed to engage in prostitution.
Can we also maybe ask women for their opinion?
We're having some issue here with technology again. But what I was going to say, let me play the devil's advocate here, because they agree to the degree that, as Matt says, they're even capable of giving their consent. But to the extent that they do give their consent and they do engage in sexual prostitution, they now make it to adulthood, whereas they would not have done otherwise. Is that relevant at all to the analysis? I mean, nobody else is stepping up. I mean, yes, these are horrible people who are abusing children and exploiting them. But on the other hand, and even though this seems really warped, these children would not have survived but for this particular form of exploitation. Does that have any impact on your analysis at all? And should it in any way be relevant? Because making it to adulthood usually seems to be, sort of the aim, the goal of every parent. And of course, in this case, some parents, hand their children over to the trade. Is it at all relevant? They got their child to adulthood. Doesn't that matter? Or is this like just a horrific choice where there's no good response? Linda? Sorry, I know I'm calling on you guys arbitrarily, but I can't see raised hands. So Linda, what do you think? She's typing. Could you repeat the question? I apologize, I stepped out for a moment. Okay, so the point of the article is that these children retain their dignity even though they engage in prostitution, that they engage in prostitution because they and their families are desperate, because the people who exploit them in this manner are prepared to in some ways support them, and that although there are obviously instances where they acquire HIV, for instance, that the primary point here is that they on the whole will make it to adulthood, whereas they may have starved to death otherwise. So how do you assess that? She's typing. What I think is interesting while she's responding to that is that we have always treated those who engage in the sex trade, or not as victims, but rather as being people of the lowest sort. And it's sort of astonishing when one considers the factors that lead to them becoming or engaging in prostitution. Again, if it was the only option to survive, then surely we should be assessing that differently, particularly when states and the international community fail adequately to provide for them instead. So Linda, you're still typing there. Or typing. One of the things I introduced in my novel, in the Angela hypothetical, was that some of the people who were trying to support Angela were quite literally willing to do anything, including violate the law, in order to protect her and provide for her continuing survival. And this is sort of relates to that as well. Okay, children are still minors with limited opportunity to provide for themselves and to advocate for themselves, because international organizations don't lend the space or platform for them to voice their opinion or to be involved in the development of declarations, etc. They are still very much dependent on adults and superiors, and therefore have very limited agency. And she adds limited agency in the eyes of the law. And certainly, Linda, you're right about that, but the reality is also If children cannot, as Matt says, consent to sex, particularly to the sex trade, don't we actually, aren't children in some way different from adult human beings? I mean, and isn't it right for us to regard them as being different? I mean, obviously, you know, when you start talking about children have a limited opportunity to advocate for themselves, the reality is well, yeah, because they're children. They have a limited education, they have a limited vocabulary, they have a limited understanding. And the younger the child, the more this is true. So if you have a child who's in your arms, a mere infant, you know, and the idea is that they should participate in these kinds of activities or vote. I mean, what are you going to do? Take the little kid's, you know, little foot and, you know, put a little print on the ballot and say, baby voted for this? Obviously, at some point, that doesn't even make sense, even though that is the constructivist point of view, that children should be treated precisely as all other human beings. But does it work? Is it even possible or meaningful to do that? I mean, okay, you're talking about a 12-year-old or 13-year-old or 14-year-old. We're going to perceive that differently than when we're talking about a 2-year-old or 3-year-old, a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, right? I'm going to pick on somebody else. Oh, here we go. Linda DeSantis says, the UN has implemented certain measures to attempt to have children participate in the development of declarations and articles directly impacting children. However, the extent of the efficacy of this is debatable. Okay. Pretty much my point exactly. Alexis, are you here? Who's AC? Alexis, I see you're here. What do you have to say? Oh, we got 3 people typing now. Laura, while they're doing their typing, what do you have to say?
Well, I definitely agree that there's a difference between young children and like children above the age of 11 or 12. But since adulthood is generally defined as 18 just by current standards, I don't think you can really, like, it wouldn't be easy to change that definition legally, like, in order to treat adolescents as adults in international law. So it's a difficult problem to address because they are dependents and because they don't have voices necessarily and because they're easily exploited.
So there's no happy you would agree?
I would agree there's no good resolution to that. But like Linda said, there are agencies in the UN that try to involve children, but I don't know to what extent that can really be an equitable involvement of children who are exploited or actually near to these issues in their countries as well. So it's difficult to implement. So
what do you think the point is then of trying to suggest that, you know, paint this picture of them as, and I'm still talking to you, Laura, while they're typing over here. What is the point of trying to suggest that they somehow retain their dignity? Shouldn't we absolutely see them as victims and treat them thusly?
The question is whether they can retain their dignity in these circumstances, or if we should treat them.
I guess I find it bizarre because she, on the one hand, says, I don't wish to support child prostitution. So I guess I just never understood what the point is of the article then.
Well, in her introduction there, let me pull it up again. It says something about trying to delineate different types of child prostitution and child trafficking. So I think she's just trying to get rid of the assumption that it all is lumped together in one definition. Since in some cases it is exploitative trafficking, like taking children and putting them into a trade system, and in other cases it's a family business kind of situation.
Right.
So that's what I understand is her argument based on that. But I don't think that's really an argument for saying that in some of these cases the children aren't victims, because I think that they can't consent, since in a lot of cases these are young children who wouldn't understand human sexuality unless it's introduced to them by adults. So it's necessarily exploitative.
No matter what.
No matter what, they're victims. No matter what, it's setting them onto a path where the skill they've developed for future professional work is going to be sexual, is going to be in the sex trade, very likely. And as a result, you're going to have this whole system of sexual abuse and sexual relationships and sexual work, and then that's going to proliferate diseases among these people as well. So I think that it's a necessarily negative situation, and therefore the children involved in it are also victims who would not freely choose this line of work given the option.
So it's kind of, I guess we have to agree then that it's kind of weird to try to find something positive in a situation which I think is wholly and necessarily negative, right?
Right.
And
But then in her introduction it says there is no blanket solution to the problem, and different forms of prostitution require very different methods and ideologies of intervention. So I think that's her point, is that there can't be one solution because there are varying systems in place.
so one size does not fit all.
Yes.
And I also think it's very interesting because these children feel the need to protect and defend their parents, right? I mean, which is a natural thing for a child to wish to do. And so, you know, if you asked a child to sort of point a finger at its own parent, they would be reluctant to do so, right?
Right.
Which is terribly sad, but nonetheless true. So it's a difficult thing. There's another article, Baradin and Barclay, and they say what is interesting about the obsession with the sex trade is that relatively few children are actually involved or affected by it. Primarily, children are subject to other forms of labor, mostly in the agricultural sector. The conditions are harsh, and the tools that they are forced to work with are often dangerous. They are often exposed to harsh chemicals, including fertilizers. Of course, the primary cause for child labor is poverty, and forcing children to work to support the family, rather than getting an education, merely perpetuates poverty over time. The global economy also plays a role where free trade encourages states to specialize in their comparative advantage. For most third world states, their advantage is cheap labor, and of course the labor of children is the cheapest of all. Interestingly, third world countries oppose any tariff walls erected to exclude products, agricultural or otherwise, that involve the use of child labor. As with so many issues in the third world, these kinds of sanctions are as likely to harm as to help the very children that they are designed to protect. The children are driven out of industries that have been subject to sanctions, are forced into other industries that are even more dangerous than the ones that they were formerly working in, and even more poorly paid. She proposes the use of fair trade associations that voluntarily regulate the entire chain of production. The authors maintain that this approach has been more successful than official state interventions, including prosecution, where prosecutions in developed states affect only a minuscule fraction of the industries employing child labor, and where third world states simply have inadequate resources to prosecute child traffickers. What do you have to say about that? I mean, I have to say the argument that the primary comparative advantage of third world states is their cheap labor, and hence, you know, child labor as well. Again, it's this sort of leave us in the same fix that the sexual trafficking issue does, that there's no good way to address this. Francesca is typing over here. Anybody else? Oh, and Linda's typing as well. Notably, Francesca said that she agreed with Laura as to the last article, that children can consent and therefore their rights are automatically exploited. Oh, that was Alex on my computer. Now this is me. Francesca says, I don't think that there are good ways to address child labor laws or prostitution. Still typing, guys. Sorry about this. Takes a bit longer to communicate this way, huh? Did you guys quit? I don't see any more typing. Oh, no, Linda is. Okay. If we draw a connection between trafficking and its role in migration, it is difficult to implement any sort of change because many of these exploitations are in third world countries, and people migrating from third world countries end up in other third world countries. Okay. Danielle says, I agree with Linda. And I should say, if they migrate to first world countries, they're just as likely to be exploited. You know, like the folks that work in our agricultural sector during harvesting. Children are also utilized for harvesting. So the fact of the matter is they're subject to what is arguably abuse if they come here to the United States to help with the harvest. Yeah, Doris says yes, even more so in first world countries. I think she's right about that. So it is not necessarily true that kids who come to the United States or to European countries have a better shot than they would have done if they'd stayed in their own country. In fact, in some cases, they may be worse off by having come here, although we'd like to think otherwise. Anyway, okay, so I'm going to move forward to Paige Tackett. She raises the question of cultural imperialism in another way. She gives the case of the Haitian earthquake and the arrest of missionaries who were effectively abducting children who still had families. The first concern in such disasters is the reunification of families. The missionaries did not bother to find out whether the children in question had families. The author proposes the creation of an international agency to oversee the process of reunification, that is to say, and child adoption rather than the imperialistic intervention of the great powers. And I believe that, in fact, that convention already exists. We are left, however, with this uncomfortable question, at least in my view. I believe it's the Hague Convention, and I can look it up and send it along to you. I recognize that preserving parental rights is immensely important, but ensuring that children have safe homes is of equal import. Do we merely downgrade the best interests of the child in importance to ensure that children are not parted from their families? Families that, notably in the case of Haiti, had already abandoned their children to servitude. The measures that the international community have adopted are incredibly cumbersome. to guarantee there is no family member prepared to take custody of a child? Or does prioritizing children's interests over their parents just become genocide as defined by Article 2E of the Genocide Convention, which includes forcibly transferring children to another group? Anybody have any feelings about that? I think I've mentioned to you I go to the Congo often, and my friend who is a pastor there, he is, really is an exponent of delivering children into the care of first world couples. Now, it's interesting because I also, while there, met some first world couples who were already prepared to adopt some children, only to discover that the children that they were looking to adopt did in fact have existing parents. Now, the question then becomes, if you love your children, and a couple from the first world who has substantial resources, certainly vastly superior to your own, is prepared to adopt your children, what would you do? Is the pastor or minister and my friend wrong to promote the adoption of children? I mean, he's not looking to make money. He just wants to see children placed where they will be best off. Is that all wrong, or what is that about? I mean, ideally, of course, we should be supporting these children in their own country with their own families, but we don't do that. So if you are a pastor and you see Congolese children dying, suffering from malnutrition and disease and dying, literally, of poverty, what would you think? What would you do? What would you think would be the right thing to do? Matt, I'm going to bother you again with people over here typing.
In terms of how to best address child poverty?
Well, I mean, again, I'm talking about a minister. He was trained in the ministry here in the United States, but he has been a strong advocate of placing children in the care and custody of willing couples from the first world. He has never said directly that some of these people have existing families, but it's my suspicion that that's likely true. So, is he a terrible, awful person?
Well, I mean, I guess.
May I say, Danielle, the pastor's the best intentions, but there's still an element of the white savior complex. Yes, but this guy's an indigenous Congolese. He's not. He's not suffering from a white savior complex. Matt, go ahead.
So I guess an important question to answer would be, in the cases where these children do have existing families, did they talk to the families first, or did they abscond with these kids?
I'm not clear. Again, this is something I've never really taken up with him and sort of interrogated him about. My guess?
Yeah.
My guess, I don't think that they're absconding with the kids. My impression is that these families could not support their children. These children might well have ended up being street children or what have you. There was a lot of street children in Kinshasa. So, rather than see a child end up that way, engaging in violence, engaging in prostitution, engaging in whatnot, but he would rather have seen the transfer of their care to somebody with resources when the child is young and most likely to be able to be placed. So what do you think?
Right. Well, I guess in cases where the family has sort of willingly put their kid up for adoption because either they themselves don't feel that they're offering their kid a suitable childhood, then I guess that's fine. Parents place their kids up for adoption all the time. But again, I would want to know more about sort of the circumstances under which these kids are placed up for adoption.
So you would want to feel certain that the parents were actually consenting.
Right.
And in this set of circumstances, what constitutes consent may not be clear. Does the parent know that they're giving up their legal rights in their children? I mean, we're talking about people who are literally, live in the bush, right? I mean, what do they have the sophistication even to comprehend, what's being proposed to them? Danielle says, I don't think that adoption is addressing the root causes of the developing world. Francesca says, I agree with Danielle. I think that adoptions may help individual children, but it doesn't address the root economic issues. And Danielle goes on to say, yes, and it is also a lucrative business. And I will concede that again. I don't think that my pastor friend is engaged in a lucrative business, but I will also agree that certainly there are people who make money at it. There's no question about that. You know, that they're basically selling children. But even that leaves us back in the same spot. Because if those children would, not likely make it to the age of 5, how do you perceive that? I mean, the couple that was very concerned about that issue was, deeply religious couple who had come to adopt children, and they had their own children. They were largely guided by their religious beliefs, wanting to adopt children and add to their family. And they felt that they were, violating the relevant conventions, and they certainly did not want to be party to trafficking of children. But, on the other hand, and here I will go back to my own parents' situation years ago, they decided to, I'm missing the word, gosh. When you take a child into your house, but you're not adopting them, you're taking care of them for the period while they're looking for a long-term solution.
Fostering?
Thank you. So my parents were foster parents for this kid who apparently had like 170 IQ. He had been sexually abused by his parents, specifically his father. And, they were deeply committed to this child, taking care of him, making sure that he had the best outcome. And suddenly they got informed by the powers that be that they had to return this child to none other than the father. And they were so devastated by it, they refused to have anything further to do with it. So, I mean, how do you deal? I mean, in that case, we're talking about abuse, but in these other cases, we're talking about parents who literally cannot feed their children. And yes, certainly I agree we need to address the issues concerning the developing world, but doesn't seem to be a lot of hurt to do that. So if we can only help one child at a time, is that not a desirable outcome? At least we've helped one child.
I've known people in the past who have, well, I haven't known them personally, but I've known of people in the past who adopted children from other countries because they were very religious. And I don't think it's fair to say that it's a bad thing or that it's for a lucrative purpose or anything like that, because the individuals who choose to do that, especially out of religious motivation, honestly feel that they are helping because they don't think that they have the ability or the power to address the root economic issues, because that is much too complex for an individual to really tackle. So I think that people who try to adopt are trying to make a difference in one individual's life and make life better for one individual by taking them to a first world country, which, like, you can of course criticize that as well if you want to, but I think that if you're looking at an individual person's motivations, I don't think it's fair to criticize people when they're doing.
But Danielle says that this is a white savior complex. You think that's a fair assessment?
I would say that there's certainly an element to that to an extent, because within Christianity itself, it's a religion based on evangelism. You're expected to try to spread it to the world and try to spread it to people who don't know about, Christianity. And so I think the savior complex is a necessary part of that. And I think that adoption is going to be a result of that as well, because evangelism. I don't know. I don't have a really big conclusion about that, but I think that the savior complex is necessarily part of it. Yeah.
Okay. And is that inherently an evil? Andrew, speak to that. Is that inherently an evil? If you think that all you can do is save one child, you can't save the whole country. Is that even if it is a savior complex, is it inherently an evil?
Andrew just stepped out to go to the washroom.
Oh, he's not permitted to do that. Shame on him. Okay, Matt, I'll ask you. Try to get a balanced gender view here. Matt, you there?
Okay.
So what do you think is that inherently an evil?
Like white savior complex?
Well, I mean, I grant you, Laura has said yes, she thinks that probably there's a white savior complex involved. But so if you're going to say, okay, so these are bad people because they have a white savior complex, does that mean that, okay, so nobody should help? We're just going to step back and say, okay, then let these poor kids rot and die. Is that a better solution?
Well, I mean, like it's one of those things where I guess really that complex comes into play when a person feels that they're just sort of rescuing people from this like ostensibly like savage condition, which like is highly presumptuous and highly.
Hey, back up.
imperialistic,
Are you on top of what's been going on in the Congo?
Right, there's like especially in the east part of the country, there's a massive rebel campaign that's been highly destructive and has killed thousands of people within the last year.
And
But,
and the things that they do, I mean, they chop people's limbs off with machetes. I mean, rape child soldiers, the whole shebang. I mean, forgive me, but in this case, massive savagery isn't an accurate depiction of what's really happening in eastern Congo. It's that bad.
I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that adoption and like sort of taking kids out of this context isn't inherently a bad thing. It's just important to interrogate like what are the other factors here. Again, like I don't think that adoption is inherently bad in any way. In fact, if you can save a life by doing so, great. But I think also it's important not to presume that an adoption is the only means of saving a kid. And I think there's also much more that needs to be done. For one family, I think adoption is a very direct way of taking a kid out of that context. But there are so many. It's such a complex issue, and there's so many contributing factors here that are leading to greater destruction.
But Laura said, fixing an economy, the global economy, and how it affects the third world is way above the payroll, the pay grade of most individual people, well beyond their means intellectually, or in terms of the political power they may have at their disposal. So do you, yeah, we all agree something needs to be done, but how do you assess that, Andrew? I was asking you and you had stepped out. How do you assess that?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the full question because I just got back?
Sure. The issue is that there's an element of a white savior complex here.
Right.
That adoption isn't addressing the root causes of the developing world. That adoptions help individual children, but it doesn't address root economic issues. And of course, Daniel adds, and it can be a lucrative business, and certainly there are middlemen who have, or women sometimes who clearly are engaged in a kind of slave trade. But all that aside, if you parse that out and you make every effort to ensure that the child that you are adopting, you are doing so legitimately,
Mm-hmm.
do you attack them on the basis that they have a white savior complex, or do you say that somehow what they're doing is wrong because it doesn't address the bigger issues? Or how do you even wrap your mind around all of this?
Well, I think it's important to know that not everybody who adopts necessarily has this white savior complex, or they might, but at a subconscious level, they could honestly be doing it for genuinely conceived reasons.
Right.
And I don't think you can fault an individual who has made the decision to adopt for the systemic problems that exist on the other side of the world in the country, because in their mind, they're just trying to help this one individual when they can. But I also think it is imperative on us as a society to be politically aware of the problems that are causing this crisis that might exist in another country and work toward a solution more through political means than anything. I'm just trying to say, I think we have to parse these issues out separately and not necessarily blame one course of action for impairing another course of action, if that makes any sense.
I think it's heartbreaking, truly.
Yeah.
I should know, Danielle says, I don't think adoption is wrong. And
right, and that's sort of what I'm saying too.
But, you know, I don't think, and Francesca adds, I don't think that we should conflate the deeply problematic issue of Western adoption with the idea that adoption is evil, fair to say. But, you know, of course, as you may or may not know, for many years here in the United States, at least until the Clinton administration, attempts by white couples in the United States to adopt African American children or children of other ethnic or racial backgrounds was condemned as being a form of genocide. And finally, you know, the Clinton administration said, well, this is just BS, you know, these kids need help, they need it now. I don't give a crap, you know, whether the couple's white, black, or purple. And I have to say, I felt a great deal of sympathy for that position. Let's move on to Geraldine Van Buren. She discusses the concept of child democratic citizenship and child parliaments. This is the ultimate case that children are just like adults and should possess all the rights of adults. She suggests that children should be treated as both national and international citizens. It is the ultimate constructivist position. While the CRC and the Council of Europe promote the education of children in relation to citizenship, the notion that children should actively participate grew out of their participation in drafting the CRC. Children are conceived of by the CRC as right holders, especially as to socioeconomic rights. Moreover, where rights are interdependent and indivisible, they also possess civil and political rights. They are no longer invisible to the political process despite historical disenfranchisement. In the author's view, it is inadequate to maintain that children are enfranchised through their parents, especially where, for instance, they are orphans. Moreover, there is no requirement that parents consult with their children before casting a vote. Children also need to be able to access courts directly on their own behalf, especially as to the violation of their socioeconomic rights. This is in the best interest of children, which the courts are in any event under an obligation to enforce. Multi-generational citizenship conceptualizes children as having the legal capacity to ensure the creation of a socially just society that is enjoyed while children are still children. In short, children should not have to rely on adults to take action on their behalf. We've already addressed this a bit, and frankly, I can't help but say it seems to be a little crazy, but I'm going to go back to Amelia. Amelia says, Hi, can we back up for a minute? We're a little confused by what you mean when you say adoption of black children by white couples is genocide. Did you mean cultural genocide? And the answer to that is, this is a provision on the Genocide Convention, and as we discussed just before you guys started your midterm, it is the only provision of the convention that was actually cultural as opposed to physical genocide. So yes, the answer is it is cultural genocide, but it is also provided against in the Genocide Convention. That makes sense? Does that answer your question, Amelia? Amelia? Still typing. Alex says, no, it doesn't make sense. Why? Does the provision in the document specifically prohibit adoption because it could be construed as genocide? Okay. The issue was basically what happened, for instance, with Indigenous Americans. The custody of the children was transferred to religious institutions, and the intent was to destroy the Indigenous Americans' cultures by forcing them to speak English, by forcing them to adopt Western religion, specifically Christianity. But But what happened prior to the Clinton administration is there was the perception that, and this is probably true, that persons of color were more likely to lose custody of their children than similarly situated white persons, and therefore, if a person of color, especially African Americans, lost custody or rights in their children, it was transferred to a white couple, that this was ultimately motivated by genocidal intent. And I think that was, at least I felt that was an unfair assessment. It is certainly possible that more Black Americans lost custody of their children than white Americans. But the transfer of children to somebody else's custody in that child's best interest, I do not think that was intended to be genocide. At least that was my view. And to which we got the response, oh, okay. So, anyway, we've already discussed a little bit about what it means to try to argue that children should be treated exactly as adults. It's unrealistic. So Eliza Ponce goes on, and she tries to take a more balanced approach to the best interests of the child. Obviously, there are circumstances where a child that is a person under 18 years of age is more like unto an adult than a child. There's that obvious adolescent period where, they have clearly a mind of their own, they've been developing their own worldview, they have a larger body of information at their disposal, and they're more capable of making decisions on their own behalf. I don't think that Ms. Van Buren was really considering an infant or a toddler or even a preteen when she made her argument that children should be treated as adults. The argument that children should always be treated as adults is not always in the interest of children even as they approach 18. The Ponce article is obviously written from a very American perspective. The case she starts with is Roper v. Simmons, which held that children are inherently different and should therefore be exempt from capital punishment. Well, hell yes. Obviously, we want, children to be exempt from capital punishment. You know that the frontal lobe is not fully developed unless and until you are about 22 years of age. You do not possess the same capacity for making judgments about your acts as a fully developed adult with a fully developed adult human brain possesses. Of course, most of the world has rejected capital punishment in its entirety. And this therefore hardly recommends our law. However, I believe that the rest of the article is a bit more persuasive. In America, unlike France, the parent mediates the relationship between the state and the child. The state may only intervene in the relationship between a child and its parent where the parent's acts somehow endanger the child. We've already seen that when we discussed the Yoder case some time back, that the parent, and Andrew, you had issues about this, that the parent gets to decide what the religious training of the child is until the child leaves, obtains its majority or is liberated from the household by some other means. The state nonetheless holds a stake in the child-family balance. The state is basically, at least in the United States, the fallback for the family. If the family fails, the child becomes the ward and responsibility of the state. According, the state has a parent's patria power to act in the best interests of the child. As such, the state can enact law, create programs, and restrict the rights of children, provided they do not violate the rights of the parent vis-a-vis their children when doing so. Hence, we see the state set curfews, impose minimum drinking age, and enact compulsory education laws. She discusses in particular the juvenile justice system. It has been a mixed blessing. It was premised on the notion that when children commit crimes, they do not possess the same sort of culpability that adults do, in which I'd obviously be in agreement. In general, this seems like it should be a good idea. However, what has happened is that children have been subject to a system that often does not have adequate due process protections, even though it leads to penalties that may actually be greater than the penalties that an adult may receive were he or she to commit the same crime. Hence, when advocating for children, it may often be the case that it is more just to argue that the children are like adults. But of course, this assumes that the juvenile justice system has lost its way, which this article would in fact appear to suggest. Similarly complicated is the question of young people's discretion over their bodies. Children are generally denied the right to make medical decisions on their own behalf on the basis that they do not possess a sophisticated understanding of their medical options, but they increasingly engage in sex at young ages, as we certainly are aware, and girls become pregnant. So what then? Do they get to decide whether they will have abortions? If they carry the pregnancy to term, do they have the same responsibilities to their children that their parents have to them? This becomes something of a paradox when they are entitled to make medical decisions for their children when they are not yet of age to make the same medical decisions on their own behalf. Then there are questions related to custody, emancipation, and marriage. Should a child have input into who will have custody of them? Are there circumstances where a child is better off emancipated from their parents? What of a child marrying before the age of 18? I think I sent along a human rights thing asking you to sign for getting rid of child marriage in the state of Florida. We just recently did that here in the state of New York. We still had a child marriage provision on New York books, even though it seems wildly out of date. In any event, suddenly a married child is possessed of all the rights of an adult merely because they got married before the age of 18. It appears then that Pons thinks that these are issues that should be addressed on a case-by-case basis, although, every state has rules as to how much input a child may have in any of these situations. Obviously, the closer a child is to 18, the more like an adult that child is, although I again pause to note, yes, but even at 18, your brain is not yet fully developed. However, there are children who are 12 that possess greater intellectual capacity and or greater maturity than many 18-year-olds. Moreover, even as to 18-year-olds, it should be considered that their brain is not yet fully developed, as I've already said. The frontal lobe is responsible for executive function and is not fully developed until about 22 years of age. Executive function helps you, 1, manage time, 2, pay attention, 3, switch focus, 4, plan and organize, 5, remember details, 6, avoid saying or doing the wrong thing, that is, exercise judgment, and 7, do these things based on your experience. So when executive function isn't working as it should, one's behavior is less controlled. So it is never true that children are just like adults. In fact, 21, although it was always understood to be an arbitrary cutoff pay for deeming someone to be an adult, is actually inaccurate, because probably if you really are addressing it vis-a-vis our actual biophysical development, then 22 should actually be the date of the cutoff. At most it is true that some children, under some circumstances, are more similar to adults than children. At such times, their rights may properly trump the rights of their parents and even of the state. It can also be true, however, that regarding children as being different from adults can limit the state's rights vis-a-vis them, as the Roper v. Simmons case itself establishes. So what do you think? Is there something inherently wrong with prosecuting children as adults? And how do you gauge that response when you consider that children may be subject to lengthier sentencing and rehabilitation than an adult who committed the same crime? Any responses? RX, you've been quiet here for a while. What do you think?
I think you asked me whether the children should bear the full responsibility for his own behavior, and if that's the question, then my answer is the reading shouldn't be responsible for their own behavior, because legally speaking, the children's moral behavior is the outcome of their parents' failure of custody. So,
yeah, but is always true. I mean, the reality is that, you know, I guarantee you, and this may not be as persuasive to you as perhaps it is to me, but, you know, the really common case is the child is raised in a deeply religious family. Maybe daddy is a minister or you know, whatever. They're the sort of folks that go to a church every Sunday. They do all the right things. You know, they give their kid a moral training. You know, they are duly punished when they misbehave. They do all those things, and what happens? Kid says, you know, screw this, I'm out of here, and starts misbehaving in rebellion to what is a fairly rigid morality that is imposed on the child. So, you know, perhaps there are other cases where the child simply hangs out with the wrong kids. I mean, peer pressure is a real deal, particularly for teenagers, well, even younger, but especially for teenagers. They go off, they get in all kinds of trouble. Not because mommy and daddy failed. Mommy and daddy did everything they were supposed to do, but it didn't work out. So, you know, is it really the parents' failure? By the way, RX, my husband has voiced the same opinion many times, so I think maybe this is sort of a Chinese thing. But go on, what do you think?
Yeah, I think maybe that will depend on the children's age. Meaning that if they are above 16,
Mm-hmm.
maybe they have the they can take control of their behavior, and they have established their own opinion towards the surroundings. So maybe they can bear the responsibility for themselves. But I think even if that circumstances, they don't really have this financial capacity to really bear the responsibility.
Okay. Well, here's the really difficult thing, I think, when you're dealing with adolescents. First of all, it is developmentally necessary for a child of a certain age to begin to establish independence from the parent. I think anybody who's been around kids about this age, you know, the parents know nothing. They're stupid idiots. They're uninformed. They're not up to date. And they have nothing of value to say to them. And this is just like inherently part of the deal. This is what teenagers do. I have to tell you that when I was a kid, I hated adolescence. When I was an adolescent, I hated adolescence. And you know, quite frankly, I teach at this level because I just really don't enjoy spending my time with adolescents. They're just miserable kids. So what do you think? You know, what can parents do? I mean, perhaps they have limits on their ability to limit their children's behavior, but on the other hand, we're talking about children that are going through a developmental stage. It's a miserable one. For them as well. I told you I didn't much care for adolescence when I was one. You know, it's a very, very difficult period of time in their lives. You know, those old hormones are kicking in, you know, there's pressure to have sex. Oh my God, it goes on and on. It's just awful. And of course, they're very sensitive to the judgments of their peers. Therefore, peers have, you know, unduly great influence over their behaviors. And obviously, as we've already said, their brain is not yet fully developed. So what do you do with these kids? I mean, when a teenager goes off and does a horrible crime, like apparently you probably heard this on the news. This group of teenagers was throwing rocks off the edge of a bridge, and you know, I guess that their intent was merely to cause property damage, but ultimately, of course, as someone whose judgment was fully developed would have known, somebody was killed. Should they be prosecuted as adults? Because that was the intent of the people. That is to say, the district attorney of the jurisdiction where these kids committed this crime.
How old are these kids?
They're all adolescents. The one of them was already charged as an adult because they were technically adults as a matter of law. They were all teenagers though, and the other ones they were deemed juveniles, but were going to be. Or the prosecutor stated that they intended to prosecute them as adults, which the law provides them the ability to do. But, I mean, okay, these are guys. Maybe we need a guy to talk about this. Matt, what do you think about this? Andrew, speak up. Because this seems to be like a stupid guy thing. I can't imagine girls even doing this. What do you think,
Yeah,
man?
that's ridiculously stupid. That's like the stupidest thing I can imagine. Like there's really no defense for like killing a person.
But they weren't intending to kill anybody. They
Right,
thought it
like,
was amusing to
it
draw
was-
rocks off the side of the bridge and damage the vehicles passing by.
Right, but I mean, like, though it was a mistake, I mean, it's still manslaughter. I mean, that's like I get trying them as kids because they are technically kids, but I mean, in my not so expert legal opinion, I just think that's a remarkably stupid thing to do.
But boys in particular do remarkably stupid things all the time. I'm sorry.
Right.
I know I'm being judgmental of your gender, but when I was in law school, there were these two kids. It was at one of the city zoos, and I was actually having this conversation in connection with this other event that just occurred. And these two kids were like throwing things, rocks, sticks, what have you, through the cage bars at these polar bears inside the cage. And this was back at a time when the city zoos were not especially humane to begin with, nor were they well taken care of. I was evinced by the fact that one of the kids managed to wiggle its way into the polar bear cage, and God forbid the damn polar bear killed the kid. How stupid! You're throwing rocks and sticks at this polar bear. You get in the cage with them and you expect it. What? Kids are stupid. They just are. They're stupid. I'm sure that these kids throwing these rocks off the side of the bridge never considered the possibility that someone would actually be killed. Any more than this kid considered the possibility that a polar bear would eat his ass, which it did.
Well, I guess in this case, this is criminally stupid, which I guess is
The Darwinian Award, that's what my husband would say. It deserves the Darwinian Award, but go on. But anyway, so I mean, how do you deal with that? Because they're just not, they're just not exercising judgment. They don't have a fully developed ability to reason things out. Okay, so Amelie says, at some point it's not the child's fault, it's the parent's fault for not parenting, ? Danielle says, I don't know if this is super relevant, but I used to work for a prison education program, and they were newly implementing an initiative to segregate men between 18 through 25 into their own block because their frontal lobe is not fully formed. That is, the executive processing, decision-making, etc. is not fully developed. So although they were tried as adults, the state, at least the state of Connecticut, still believes they are different from the general adult population. For instance, Amelie says, Ray the child and the polar bear. Okay. So what do you think? I mean, Daniel's observations are well said. I mean, we're talking about a population group that's, not quite all there yet. Does that matter? If you were the prosecutor, how would you deal with this? I mean, it's a horrible crime. A father lost his son. Was devastated, of course. But they showed videos of the parents of the children who committed the crime sobbing and crying because, as a product of what they had done, their life is over, done, finished. Even if they survive, they now have a murder felony, a murder conviction on their record. It's over now. You don't come back from that. So how do you deal with that? They were idiots. Polar bear level idiots. How do you deal with that? Andrew, you're quiet over there. I still think this is something that maybe the guys have more insight on. Or Grant, are you still here?
I'm still here.
I'm sorry, I really can't speak on this. It's something I just can't understand.
So you think they're astonishingly stupid? Grant, you talk about it. What do you think?
I mean, I guess it's testosterone, right?
That's part of the problem, sure. I mean, I told you earlier that the mix of high levels of testosterone with an underdeveloped frontal lobe means that basically you really actually have a psychopath for a period of years until the frontal lobe is properly developed. They're just nutso. They're crazy. Grant, what were you going to say?
I say, I agree with that. Like, what are the parents doing at this point? Like, why is the kid crawling into the polar bear cage, and the parents are just like, well, boys will be boys.
The parents weren't there, obviously. These kids were, on their own. They were visiting the zoo by themselves, and they did this thing, and there was no adults around to see them do it. So a kid gets eaten. So, but I mean, I'm more interested not so much in the fate of the poor child that got eaten because he's just plain stupid. Idiot. But what about the fate of these kids who harm someone else, not themselves? How do you deal with that?
I mean, their intent wasn't to kill anybody. They were just kids being stupid. Like,
well, it's criminal negligence, isn't it? Shouldn't they have foreseen that it could kill someone, or can you even acknowledge that maybe they really didn't foresee that? Maybe they really didn't understand that.
Yeah, I don't think they saw that at all. I think they just thought moving targets for rocks. I don't think that they looked into it at all as, oh, let's do this thing that'll be very dangerous and might kill people. I think it was just complete and total moving targets for rocks.
And you think that's basically the level they were functioning at? Matt, do you want to say something?
I mean, I still maintain that I think it's remarkably stupid. Yes, I agree with Grant. Like, it's not really their intent to kill, but I think it's still important that the distinction be made that like this is like criminal stupidity on this level.
So do you get charged for criminal stupidity?
I mean, in the case of manslaughter, yes.
And do you think there should be some kind of differentiation in the treatment of kids who are being charged with criminal stupidity?
Well, I mean, they charge minors differently than they charge adults, right? So I mean, I guess.
Yeah, but not always, because the prosecutor here intended to charge them as adults and prosecute them as adults.
I'm not sure if I entirely agree with that. Seeing as they are minors, I think they are entitled to the treatment of a minor under the eyes of the law. At least based on my knowledge of the case. Now, if there's other factors that I'm not aware of, then that might change that opinion.
Okay, Andrew, you don't get to get away free on this. That you don't understand they were that stupid. I mean, you were a kid once. You were around kids like this. Come on. What?
Yes. Well, I think sometimes when you're younger and you're around your peers, there's this tendency to want to, be funny or be cool. So I think that is what ultimately engenders stupidity. Is there's like almost a competition to be to the lowest common denominator, that to the extent that it sort of blurs your capacity to then think rationally about what you're actually doing.
So do you think the hazing case where that kid in college recently was killed, I guess they were charged with manslaughter and then they were let off. Do you think that was the right outcome?
Charged with manslaughter?
Yeah.
I personally do think that in that particular case, that probably was the right charge, because when somebody is of that age, no matter what excuse they come up with, like impaired in some way or just, trying to be funny or whatever, like you are ultimately still aware of the consequences of your behavior, or at least you should be.
Yeah,
and
but the point is that these people were not.
Or a tangible violent outcome, you have to be held responsible for that.
But they weren't. The point is that they weren't. So
right.
So you think they should have been?
Yes, I do in that particular instance. I mean, stupidity is not always an excuse, especially when there's death involved, it's like for severe injury.
Well, basically, by failing to call 911, they denied this kid the opportunity to get the medical help he needed, which led ultimately to their death. So there was two steps. There was the drunkenness. There was whatever violence may have been used, whether it was supposed to be amusing or not. And then there was the deprivation of medical help after the kid fell down the stairs and was unconscious.
And then they made the decision not to seek medical help. I'm sure somebody there, or at some point in their mind, they must have realized, oh, we need to call somebody for help. So they made two bad decisions then. And perhaps if they had made the wiser decision to contact the medical authorities more quickly, we could have a different discussion about this. But since they were so impaired that they couldn't do either.
Yeah, but does that feed into it at all? They're still impaired. They're drunken. And you know, they think, oh, the guy's just laying there because he's drunk too. Could they make a judgment that he needed a medical intervention? I mean, apparently there was some evidence that somebody there thought they should call the authorities. I believe
Right.
that's so, as I recall the facts.
The way I can see this playing out is that somebody in the group said, we need to call somebody because what has happened. And then probably somebody else was like, oh no, we can't do this. We're going to get in trouble. Realistically, that's probably what happened. So there's still some sort of dialogue happening that ultimately led to the wrong decision.
Okay, so at that point you think that there should have been culpability. Maybe not for the hazing, maybe not for the drunken kid falling down the stairs, but at some
Right.
point when they recognized the kid really needed help and declined to get help, then you think they should have been culpable.
Correct.
Fair enough. Well, anyway, so Darwinian Award for the child and the polar bear. But also interesting commentary on how urban kids really are challenged in terms of understanding, you know, that larger animals are, you know, bigger than us and can do stuff to us, and a complete incapacity to comprehend that because there's a void in our sort of basic understanding of nature. Anyway, so I guess that concludes it for today. I think that there is, you know, when it comes to children, they are obviously a vulnerable population. Obviously, we want to not treat them as property, but yet there doesn't seem to be a happy resolution of the problem because A, they lack judgment for a variety of reasons. B, they don't have sufficient information at their disposal yet to make well-informed choices, even where they have the intellectual capacity to do so. Obviously, this is a hugely difficult problem and not one easy to resolve, but I do finally, in the final analysis, have to agree with the last of the articles, which basically suggests that we have to treat it on a case-by-case basis, where we have to look at this particular child's ability to make decisions and assess the quality of his acts, rather than to sort of treat children as an all-encompassing group because they are so very different one from the other, as any parent with a family of more than one child will attest to. All right, so on that note, let's move on next week. Anybody have the syllabus in front of them? What's next? Slavery, I believe, right? Laura, what's next?
Yes, it is slavery.
Okay, so get ready for slavery next week. And also, did you have any response yet from Chuck?
Nope, not yet. No response.
Okay, well maybe I will try to call him up and see if we can make some headway in that, because I really think that would be a great thing, and I know I would personally enjoy it, and I know that if you meet this guy, you'll really have a great time with him as well. Okay, so next week it is then, and hopefully I'm still have one test outstanding, and I've been hesitant to go forward with grading in light of that fact, but I think it's more important to get these things back to you in a timely fashion, so I'm hoping that probably by next Friday I will have the test back to you, okay? So, happy weekend, and see you next week. Take care.
Have a good weekend.
You as well, bye-bye.